Hello, my online learners, and welcome to the endocrine system. This is the most confusing system because you have the organ which will secrete a hormone which will travel through the blood supply, act on another organ, which will then secrete another hormone which causes another action. So it is very complicated. Hopefully we can work through it, and I'm just looking at you getting the overall basics of it without going into too much detail. We'll save that for INTP 102 next term. Now, a little confusion if you are downloading the PowerPoints off my Google Drive. Because these are taken from an older version, the endocrine system is not chapter 12 as in the textbook, but I've noted it. I think it's chapter 10, or anyway, I've noted it on the PowerPoints. So let's look at it. Endocrine system is the body's other control system. The first control system, or the fast control system, is the nervous system. The endocrine system is seen as the slower, more consistent way that the body communicates. Now, with the endocrine system, it acts on all organs. Now, please realize that when a hormone is released, it goes into the bloodstream, and the cells that have receptors will then be targeted. So it's not specifically to one area. It goes through the whole bloodstream. Now, the functions of the endocrine system are pretty much everything, because hormones are used for pretty much everything. But when we look at it, they regulate body fluid, electrolyte balance, they cope with stress, they cope with drama, pretty much everything. When we look at the major parts, to help prevent you from, or to help keep you organized, the best way to do is to look at the diagrams on the body. So the master gland, as they say, is the hypothalamus, which is in the brain. Now, the hypothalamus releases a lot of inhibiting hormones or releasing hormones. So it causes everything, and that's because there are receptors in the brain that basically get the feedback from the receptors in the body. So the hypothalamus will then send a message to either the posterior pituitary or the anterior pituitary, and then that will send messages to most of the organs, with the exception of the pancreas. So when you look at it, you have the thyroid, and then there's the parathyroid in here. You've got the adrenal glands, which are on top of the kidneys. You have the pancreas, which is tucked in behind the stomach. The thymus gland, not to be confused with the thyroid. Thymus is down more on the base of the neck, and the thymus starts really large as a child and then shrinks as you get to be an adult. Then there's the ovaries and the testes, and we'll focus mainly on the hormones of the ovaries and testes in the reproductive unit later on. So there's enough to focus on to begin with. So here's a good diagram of where they are. Make sure you can label your organs, and then if you look, here's your primary functions of them. Okay, so when we look at it, there's all your major glands. Gonads is a fancy word for saying testes or ovaries. So you look at the location. Then when it comes to the organizational system, you have organs and glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream, and then some of them are multiple functions, and some act on others, and some regulate others, and they make loops. So that's what's so confusing about it. So when you look at the main functions, you've got the pineal gland, which releases melatonin, and melatonin will then regulate your day-night schedule. Melatonin is released in the dark, so this is why it is best if you sleep in a dark room. So get rid of the cell phone, put it behind a book or something, even turn your clock away. The darker your room, the more melatonin you have, the better it sleeps. Hypothalamus releases a huge amount of stuff. So does the pituitary. We'll focus on the adrenal a little later. Actually, no, let's do the adrenal now. The adrenal glands are stimulated long process of stimulating, but basically you have the inside, which is the medulla, and the medulla will release those stress hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. The outside of the adrenal gland is called a cortex, and it releases the cortisol, cortisone, basically words that have cort in them with the exception of aldosterone. Cortisol and cortisone act on the energy of the body, and aldosterone will act on the kidneys to regulate water. We'll talk more about aldosterone when we talk about the urinary system. Parathyroid gland is also another gland that's regulated independently. It's regulated by the calcium levels. If there is low calcium levels, the parathyroid gland will release parathyroid hormone, which will then take the calcium from your bones and put it into your bloodstream. Thyroid we'll talk about, well, thyroid is the gland that controls your energy levels, and it basically controls it by T3 and T4, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. Now notice the triiodo means there's iodine in there, and iodine is taken up by the thyroid gland. That's why you need iodinized salt, because we don't get enough salt in, or not enough iodine in our regular diet. T3 and T4 will regulate your metabolism. Calcitonin acts against parathyroid hormone, and it will decrease the calcium levels in your body, in your blood. Then there's the thymus, which releases thymosin. The pancreas, which we'll talk about a little more detail later, releases insulin, which you may have heard of. Insulin will take glucose from the blood and store it. And then there's, when your glucose is gone, glucagon is released from the pancreas in order to increase the glucose levels. And we'll talk a little bit more about the process behind that, because it's a little more complicated. As I said, the gonads, you have the, we'll deal with that in the reproductive unit. Your ovaries will release estrogen and progesterone, and the testes will release androgens, which is mainly testosterone. And then the estrogen and progesterone will go into more detail in terms of growing the egg and preparing the uterine lining. And androgens, especially testosterone, will act on sperm production. Anyway, that's a whole other thing we'll talk about more in the in the reproductive unit. Okay. The hormones are very delicate in their secretion, and they're usually released as a regulatory function, such as your temperature rises, your heart rate rises, your blood pressure rises. So they help with this homeostasis and help keeping everything regular. Okay. Here's a really confusing looking diagram, which basically says there is a stimulus, and it will result in something detecting this stimulus. It will then go to a control center, usually in your brain or your hypothalamus, which will then somehow send a stimulus which will cause an effector that will change the response, which then comes back to the receptor again. So we're going to look at this in terms of the pancreas and the liver and glucose and glucagon response, which is part of the assignment for this chapter. Okay, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is located in the brain, and it is usually seen as the commander-in-chief, or the hypogland. Now, a lot of things are released by the hypothalamus, and I don't want you to memorize them all because it's confusing. Another thing about the endocrine system is they give it a really big name so they can give it an acronym. When it comes from the hypothalamus, what I want you to do is I want you to realize the ending is either a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone. So the hypothalamus will act on the pituitary to either release that hormone or inhibit the hormone. So hypothalamus acts on the pituitary. It acts a little differently on the posterior as the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary are hormones going through the bloodstream to the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary will have this neural connection and hormones are released through that. Hypothalamus is very detailed. I just want you to realize that the hormones will either inhibit the pituitary or stimulate the pituitary to release the second layer of hormones. So don't pay so much attention to these guys. Look at these guys here. So hypothalamus releases all these things. Let's look at more detail in terms of the pituitary. The pituitary is a master gland because it controls the other hormones. It's under the influence of the orders of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus tells it what to do, then the pituitary will go and continue on with it. Let's look first at the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary is a more nervous tissue, and two things come out of the posterior pituitary. It will secrete ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. Diuretic, you may know, works on the kidney. An antidiuretic hormone will prevent the kidney from releasing urine and will cause more water absorption. Oxytocin will react on the smooth muscle of the uterus to cause contractions in childbirth. So that's the nice, simple posterior pituitary. Let's now look at the anterior pituitary. This one's a little more confusing. The anterior pituitary will act on adrenal corticotrophic hormone, and that will act on the adrenal gland, releasing adrenal corticoids. Anyway, the words are linked together, so pay attention to that. Then you have thyroid stimulating hormone, which will stimulate the thyroid gland to release the thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T4. The pituitary releases growth hormone, which acts on muscles to cause them to grow. The pituitary will act on the breast tissue, releasing prolactin. Prolactin will act on the breast tissue, and in conjunction with giving birth, will stimulate the breast to produce lactation or milk. Then the anterior pituitary will release two sets of hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They're named the same in both males and females because it's a similar hormone. In males, the follicle stimulating hormone causes the testes to produce sperm, and luteinizing hormone creates the production of testosterone. In follicle stimulating hormone on the ovary, follicle stimulating hormone will then stimulate the follicle to become an egg, and luteinizing hormone helps with the ovulation, and then the the ovaries themselves, once stimulated by these guys, will produce estrogen and progesterone. The last hormone we're going to look at is a melanocyte. It reacts with melanin in your skin to darken your skin. So very complicated. This causes this, but pay attention to this diagram, and also in your reading guide, I provided you with a table to help with the summary. So hopefully putting that together will help you. Good. Let's look a little bit more detail on the pancreas. And this is part of the activity that I want you to do for this chapter. I'm asking you to create a visual learning aid without actually copying this diagram. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the video to introduce the topic because I'm running out of time. Okay, A little bit about diabetes mellitus. Again, it works on the pancreas.